All right. Hey, everyone. It's January 19th, 2020. Again, this is the second episode we're recording today, and it's episode 216. We've got a roundtable for you. And this episode, we're going to focus on something that people have asked about over the years. And I've gotten a few requests for people saying, oh, could you please make a total dedicated episode to this? To interview related things. And there are so many interview related things. I thought, well, let's just like focus on questions specifically. So we're going to do our best to keep it related to university interview questions. And I've got a bunch of our good friends here and co-hosts. And the main concern was sort of, well, who are we to speak about these things? We're all pretty early to mid career on the university job track. So I thought it'd be probably a good idea just to, as we introduce everyone, if you guys could just quickly let us know kind of where you are on your career path as far as your university career. And I'll start. So you're listening to me. I'm Casey Cangelosi, and I'm in my fifth year at James Madison University. So I don't have tenure yet. And prior to that, I was at a little place in West Virginia called Concord University. I was an adjunct for 3 years, I want to say, and I got promoted to what they called instructor. So it wasn't yet a tenure track line. And that's where I am. And now I think I'll shoot it over to, let's say, Brian Nosny over there. How's it going, Brian?
Hey, hello. Great, thanks. Let's see. Brian Nosny, I'm in month 6 here, I guess, at McNeese State University, where I'm a assistant professor of percussion. Prior to that, I was at Troy University on a non-tenure track lecturer level for 6 years. And then prior to that, I was at Dickinson State University in Dickinson, North Dakota, where I was tenure track for 4 years. So that's my experience.
Oh, I didn't know that. How about Carly in Florida?
Hi. So right now I'm teaching at Florida International University as an adjunct. I've been there. This is my 3rd year. And I got that a couple years post DMA. And I'm also working as an adjunct at Broward College and New World School of the Arts here in Miami.
Cool, thanks. And upstairs from me in the office up there is Caleb Pickering.
Yeah, right now I'm in my first year teaching at JMU with Casey, doing the adjunct thing, trying to usurp him as quickly as I can. But
it's going good, too.
Also teaching, yeah, right. Also
Yeah.
teaching at Eastern Mennonite in the same town, Harrisonburg, as adjunct.
Cool, thanks. And Ben Charles?
Yeah, I'm in my now 4th year as a visiting assistant professor at Tarleton State University. And before here, I taught for 5 years at Florida Atlantic University. And I actually started that job the same year that I started my DMA. So I started both those concurrently.
Yeah, great. And also in Texas is Ksenia Komjonovic.
Hey, so I am at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi, and this is my first university teaching job, my 1st year, and it is a tenure track job, which makes me very, very lucky.
And Bill Shaltis in Memphis.
Hey, I'm on year 4 at the University of Memphis, just past the mid-tenure review process. Prior to that, I taught adjunct at Missouri Southern State University while I was finishing my DMA up at UMKC. And then before that, I taught for 5 years at the University of Evansville as part of a consortium position where half my job was being principal percussion at the university at the Evansville Philharmonic and then teaching at the University of Evansville.
Cool. So that's our panel. That's everyone talking. And again, like, as you hear these answers, just keep in mind that's where we all are. So none of us have been all the way through this process. There's plenty of people we'll probably bring on the show eventually. It'd be fun. We were discussing of doing this again with some much older and wiser faculty. I mean, we talked to John Parks at length about job interviews. I mean, we have had lots of people on the show. It'd be really fun to do the same sort of panel with some of them. So anyway, just like that disclaimer and, take this all with a grain of salt, of course, and know the amount of experience that you're listening to. But yes, regarding job interview questions, we had a lot of good Facebook responses. And I thought I would start with one from our buddy Justin Alexander. And he says, I find the strengths, weaknesses question particularly cringeworthy, especially in the searches I've served on/chaired. It's difficult to answer the strengths part without sounding egotistical, and it's difficult to answer weaknesses part truthfully. If the committee knows what they want in the job description, they can often see if the candidate has the requisite strengths or not from the CV/references/previous positions. If there is a question about the candidate's experience, the candidate should be asked about it directly. What inevitably results is a Herculean list of strengths and an answer like, my biggest weakness is that I'm too dedicated, boo. And I think that's a really good point Justin brings up. And I've actually been asked this question before. What is your greatest strength and greatest weakness? And again, our point of this episode is not to like give you the answers, but maybe just to like tell you what we have said and maybe what we might recommend or and or do. So yeah, I've been asked this question before, but I want to know, I don't know, does anyone have any thoughts about this one? Greatest strength, greatest weakness.
I've been asked it as well, and I usually use this as a means to try and avoid percussion, which sounds strange in a percussion interview, but I figure, I mean, Justin's absolutely right with the idea of all of your strengths and your experience, like that's laid out in your CV. Everyone can see all of that. So I tend to use it as okay, well, maybe what's a strength that I have that doesn't have anything to do with percussion, maybe more of a personal strength and then a personal weakness. And if I list a personal weakness, then I'll say, here's how I'm working on getting around that, or here's how I'm working on compensating for that.
So what's a weakness that you think is safe to admit to?
I mean, I'll just tell you the one that I always go with is usually I say that I have a problem saying no. That I tend to, when people ask me if I can do this, if I can help with this, I have a bad track record of not saying no. I tend to say yes to everything, and then I just do my absolute best to get through it. And then usually, sometimes things are not done as well as they should have, but ideally nothing ever fails, right?
Yeah,
I tend to
right.
keep all the balls in the air. It maybe not be pretty, but we get the job done. So that's usually like what my answer is, because it's the truth.
Yeah, well, and I think the truth really is important. I think people can read right away if you are going down a list of check boxes and if you are just giving a stock answer that you've heard before or that you've read as something that. So actually, I do something Brian doesn't. I do talk about percussion in this answer, and I guess I've only had to answer it once. But the thing I remember saying, and it felt really natural and felt really good, was simply greatest strength. I said something about interpersonal relationships, generating a nice culture amongst my students, and having an appropriate balance, like environment that I like. It's casual, but it's not so casual, and it's pleasant environment, but we still get stuff done, that sort of thing. But if there's the weakness, the thing I said is, percussion is so vast, and this is probably a weakness you'll find in all percussionists. We can't do everything equally well, and there's always going to be some hole in percussion playing. So I'll just say, oh yeah, I mean, the amount of times I've picked up a Pandero, or I can count them on one hand. The amount of times I've picked up steel pan is probably just two hands. It's just that there's so many percussion instruments out there. I mean, it's very, very easy to talk about your weaknesses. So in that, you're describing like knowledge. So you're telling them a pitfall that you have, but you're also explaining this broader, bigger picture, like practical insight that you have towards percussion at large. And that reflects how you will teach and how you'll approach everything, and how if a student is really good at this one instrument but not so good at this other one, well, you'll have some sympathy for that and some understanding for that.
I had a couple of things to sort of tack on to what Casey said. In a way, I think the strength question is harder, because like if you say, like my one biggest strength is teaching snare drum, like maybe they don't care about that. So I think if you pigeonhole yourself into one, like what's your greatest strength, like if that's not what they're looking for, that might not be a good thing. But one thing Casey mentioned, I've thought about and said before, which is basically, percussion is so unbelievably diverse that no, I'm not a hand drum expert, for example, and I think most of the people on this panel here are not hand drum experts, which is not to say you're not a good musician or qualified to teach. But I've heard another good strategy with this is not only do you tell what your biggest weakness is or what a weakness is, but also how you'll address it. And I think for us, one of the easiest things is, well, I'm not a hand drum player, but I bring in guest artists to sort of, fill in that gap in my knowledge. And a while back, I was talking to Anders Ostrand about a university professor, I won't say who, but a very prominent university professor that I was like, I don't think I've ever heard that person play marimba. And Anders said, oh, no, he doesn't really. He brings in guests to showcase the versatility of being a keyboard player or something like that. Like, oh, like I get it now. So yeah. But I think Bill had something.
Yeah, I was just going to add one thing that some people might find helpful to kind of codify how you would address this question is to do something called a SWOT analysis, if anybody has ever heard of that before. It's an acronym for SWOT, and it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's something that the business community does all the time. And it can really kind of focus you on what you do, both for your strengths and for your weaknesses, and then think about, okay, what are the opportunities to address both these strengths and weaknesses, and then what are threats to what I do in terms of being focused with what I do. So that can be a really, really beneficial thing. I do that. I did that at the beginning of the year just to kind of focus me on where I'm at, both for my career and what I want to do with the studio at the university. So if you haven't done that, that's something I could possibly recommend to people to try out.
I'll aim this kind of towards Ben just because he trailed off with it. I see it pop up on a lot of Facebook groups a lot and a lot of other places too. And I haven't done an interview where I've had to play. I've had to do lectures or speak, but never perform like, that 30-minute solo set. I think it was Morris Palter years ago that said his first gig, he made sure everything was super well-rounded and he demonstrated, all these areas equally, maybe even the ones he wasn't as confident in. And I think he said his next gig that he won or maybe turned down, he ended up playing like multi-rags and drum set. So anybody want to speak to maybe tailoring? Do you show a little bit of everything? Do you play like, this is what I am, this is what I do? Something like that?
I'll bite.
I'll go for that real quick. So at the University of Memphis, when I auditioned, it was just a half-hour recital. And I wanted to showcase a little bit of everything that I'm interested in as a research topic, and also to kind of show my versatility. So I did a couple of pieces for solo timpani because that was kind of a passion of mine. And then also did a piece that I had written just to show, hey, I can write pieces as well. And then tried to have just this really interesting program on top of that. So that's what worked for me.
Yeah, Ksenia?
So I think, of course, versatility is important, but I don't think that the moment when you're invited for an on-campus interview is when you start thinking about that. You think about that way before, right? And when you're first learning the repertoire, and hopefully, the recital that you perform is not going to have any pieces that you're performing for the first time in front of people. So the point is, for me, what worked was that I just chose pieces that are challenging but can showcase the type of repertoire that I like to play and endorse students to learn and so on. And I think what I've heard worked to my advantage actually was that I played a lot of standard repertoire, which some people might think is where they're shying away from, because if you play whatever con, everyone can know that you missed a note or whatever. But that actually worked to my advantage. So it supposedly I had a convincing performance. So I think just choosing what you're confident with and what you actually love and care about is going to help you on that day. If you have nerves and so on, it's just going to propel your performance forward. But obviously you're not going to go and present a marimba recital if you're not going for a marimba teaching position. So just make sure you choose wisely from what you already have in your pocket.
Yeah, I think that basically if you're not playing appropriate repertoire, that means you're probably not suited for that job, which is sort of what Ksenia was saying there. But yeah, like when I did my thing here, I tried to show some diversity. But I also played like Aphasia by Mark Applebaum, which is a piece that requires no instruments, which is sort of a weird move because they would probably like to know that you can teach their students how to play instruments.
If I could interject, I think, so that piece I've seen you perform, and maybe that's not I mean, that is sort of standard repertoire, but you do that so very well that I think it's a really cool piece, and you should always perform it because you do a great job. Yeah.
But I think where like I said, I kind of lost my train of thought. But what I was going for is I played aphasia, but I also played marimba and snare drum. And I think that if you go in there and you just do 30 minutes of Mark Applebaum, as cool as that might be, it doesn't necessarily give them confidence that you're going to teach marimba and snare drum well. I think it's important to show off the basics, I shouldn't say the basics, but the basic instruments, we could say. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm not a hand drum specialist. I'm not about to go in and play the little few licks that I can on congas just to show off, like, hey, I can do diversity too. It's not. And if I was applying for a job where I was expected to play congas, I probably should not be getting that job because I'm not a hand drum expert by any means.
So what comes to mind for me is this nugget of wisdom that Keith Aleo told to me once a long time ago, more in relation to auditions, but it applies here too, is of course we want to think about what are they looking for. If they're looking for somebody to teach hand drums, drum set, and classical percussion, okay, sure, you want to portray as many of those skills as you can, but also you have to be true to yourself. And what Keith would say is, like, it's like if you go on a blind date and you lie on the first date and say, I love baseball, and then you either later, like, you have to sit through a ton of baseball games forever and ever, or you have to admit that you lied and this actually isn't a great fit. It's that sort of thing. So I guess be true to yourself. You want to demonstrate your strengths as well as you can. And in the end, if your strengths aren't in the areas that they're looking for, it's not going to be a great fit either way.
I think it's also okay, just because you couldn't show it, and I know we're supposed to be talking about questions, not recital, but just because you couldn't show it in your recital doesn't mean you won't have a chance to show it later. So, like, if you're not a big sorry, I just got a Facebook message. If you're not a big snare drum, like, performer, you might have a chance to show you can teach it in the group lesson, when they observe you teaching in front of the whole panel or something. So I don't know if it's, if it's one of those things like, well, I better make sure I can show every little thing and that, like, that hopefully they know that about you already at this point, Yeah,
I was just gonna say, I think, like, Carly, or via Keith, I guess, brings up a really good point. If you want to represent who you are, and so if if all of a sudden you go and you just happen to learn like one, transcription or something of like a timbale thing or whatever, and you go and you play that with a play along or something like that, but it's the only thing you play and you've never played in an Afro-Cuban ensemble and you don't really know, that's that really sets a bad precedent for you. So everyone's bringing up good points. I guess for me, I always try and represent what are your strengths and make sure that they're represented. Along with I try and show as much diversity as possible without going into things that I don't really do. So, like, I have a timpani piece I always play. I have a snare drum piece I always play. I have a marimba piece that a vibraphone piece that I almost always play. And then based on those and how much time they give, I have a few marimba pieces that I might play. And I usually try and play one of my own compositions, just because at the end of the day, that's probably one of the things I'm known best for. And so I want to portray that, especially because if it's a smaller institution, maybe they might be looking at, oh, hey, this guy can wear multiple hats. He could teach composition as well. Oh, this is a good thing. So it might work to my advantage.
I would add one thing I chose to do here at JMU, which I think ended up not being necessary, but I decided to play some excerpts in my recital, and instead of traditional Carnival Overture, I played a tambourine excerpt from the whole suite for band. And this was a tip I got from a friend that said during one of their interviews, the band director asked, like, hey, you're playing all this orchestra stuff, do you care about band music? And luckily, my band director, Steve Bolstead here, he knew anyways, like, well, I get it. Band excerpts haven't really made their way into the repertoire, audition repertoire yet. So, okay, like it's fine. But I thought it was a very easy way to show, hey, like, I won't just blow off band music, and I do care about that. And as to Carly's point, that has held true. Like, I do go to wind ensemble rehearsals. I do go to symphonic band rehearsals, just even to check in a little bit. Brian.
I just think that it's funny, though, that your representation of trying to say that you care about band music is by playing an excerpt from a transcription of an orchestra piece.
Yeah, but come on. It's like, but you know.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You can cut that.
Is that right? I didn't know about that.
You're talking about the whole first suite?
Yeah, there's a whole piece for band.
Oh, I thought you said the planets. Maybe I missed.
Yeah.
Oh, no,
no. Yeah.
I'm leaving it in. Hey,
you could. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go, Bill.
I was just going to say you could pick excerpts that are in, kind of to what Ben was saying. You could pick excerpts that both exist in the wind ensemble and the orchestra repertoire. Something you might pick would be like Chester for snare drum. You could do like Festive Overture for snare drum, something like that.
The Chester part's different between band and orchestra.
Ooh.
Sorry, and I feel like I should clarify too, because our symphony band just played the transcription of the planets, which is why my head was going there.
That's fun. That's really good. Hey, so how do you all like to deal with the very likely question of recruiting? This is one that's really common, and it's such a buzz all over universities everywhere, and every university always seems to be talking about this, especially if you're going after that first job, which likely might have a recruitment issue and might have a huge part of their budget concerns are how many student bodies they have in their program. So I guess the question of, what is your recruitment strategy and how do you do that? And let's throw it to Bill first.
So what worked for me when so first of all, I made a packet actually of all these things that included my CV, what my recruitment strategy would be, my 5-year outlook, all of those things. And I handed that to the committee and to the dean and to the music chair, department chair. And what worked for me in terms of thinking about the recruitment strategy was to just do a little bit of research. So in my specific case, it was going and checking out the TMEA, that's Tennessee MEA, and the West Tennessee BOA websites, and checking out for both contest solos and what we call All West out here, and just seeing, okay, in the last 5 years, what are the top programs that are placing people in All West and are doing well at these band contests. And so there was some pretty consistent trends with that. And so I was able to pretty confidently say to the committee, yeah, these are the type of schools that I'm probably going to start with outreach first, because they tend to have players that are doing really, really well. So you solve that first for the undergrad, and then for the graduate recruitment, if that's something you have to deal with, thinking about, I think you can think in a general statement like, yeah, I'm going to do the things that we all need to do in terms of just going out, visiting, doing clinics, doing recitals, things like that, trying to make a national name for myself. So that's what I did, what worked for me.
So all I have to add to that is like hosting events at the school, like getting students on campus, having a good experience and having good interactions with faculty, hopefully admissions staff, office staff, all of that. And beyond that, I think about recruitment all the time because that's been a really big thing here in my position. And I think like there are so many things that help and that we all do, but in the end, what I've seen is I think word of mouth is the best recruitment. If people start to recommend the school, it can't always come from the faculty, but students tell their colleagues or people that they meet, and just like when there's a buzz about what's happening at the school, good things are happening. That's in reality what I think is most effective. But all these other things, what Bill mentioned, and I'm sure what all of you have on the list, you want to have prepared. I'm going to do these events. I'm going to meet these people. I'm going to these places, which might be specific to the school and the neighborhood and area and everything. But that's been my experience.
So just to tag on to what Carly was saying, what's I think it was Bill already said as well. When you talk about recruiting, it's easy to give generic answers like saying, I'll do school visits and I'll, put up recordings online. I think it's very important to have specifics. And Bill was talking about researching what the top programs are, and also knowing just the area schools and who's the band director and are they an alum of your institution, because it's easy to say, oh, well, this is the University of Miami and Carly teaches just up the street and Carly's an alum, like you can easily, and just if you can name drop like that, it's super impressive, even though you just sort of tinkered around on Google a little bit. But if I could actually kind of, speaking of specifics, directly fire this back to Carly, you've done a good recruiting effort and you now have a studio. And that's my first job also. I had very little to work with in the beginning, and it was nice to see it grow. Could you talk directly about what your recruiting efforts have been, Carly, and the results?
Sure. Yeah. When I started here, it was not thriving. I'll put it that way. I mean, it's a combination of things, and I'm always trying to pinpoint exactly which things were the most effective year to year. But what I did is I started, just offering free clinics to strategic schools in the area, the ones where I know, like, we already have students from these schools, and they're turning out people that are interested and engaged and willing to work hard. So I'd go and just meet all the students, have admissions information, and time it right too, where seniors are starting to think about what am I doing next year? Do I want to be a music major? Have all the answers to the questions. These are the audition dates. This is what you have to prepare. This is what the application process is like. So I've done that. I've done a number of events here at FIU too. I do the percussion day every year. I've brought high school students in general for all state audition workshops. Things like that. Like I said, just getting them on campus, having a good experience. And I think the word of mouth thing has been big too, because when my students that are here go back to their high schools and they talk about their experiences and people see this is what they're learning, this is what they're doing. Percussion ensemble performances. We went last year to USF for Bob McCormick's Marimba Festival. And I think that was a big thing. Like, people here were talking about that. And when the percussion ensemble plays in forums here or around, in Miami, like, just seeing like, wow, cool things are happening. It's visible. That's what I think has been most effective.
Those are all great. Perfectly. Just a couple of things to add as well. Carly, you kind of nailed it right there. I think you said before something about word of mouth was the best, but then you kind of led it into what I always feel is the best, which is your students are your best recruiters. So if your students are going out, they're going back to their high school, they're saying, oh my God, I'm learning so much, this and that. It's just such a great experience and stuff. That's going to draw students, because at the end of the day, the students are going to be honest. They're going to be the ones that tell you like, yeah, listen, studying with this person's kind of a drag or whatever. Like, so they're going to be the ones that will truly give the honest opinion, I think. And then I guess one other thing to maybe throw out there is reaching out to alumni. I mean, Ben, you said it perfectly of like, oh, well, Carly's an alumni of UM and here's how this works and stuff. When I got to McNeese, one of the first things I did was reach out to as many alumni as I knew of the program that were band directors in the area, basically to introduce myself, because for my situation, my predecessor is still here. So it was kind of like, okay, well, he's still here. I'm kind of the new guy and I'm taking over the percussion studio. And so here's who I am and here's what I can offer and so on and so forth. And that might work well, especially in a situation where if you've had someone that you're taking over that's been a legacy, if you don't go and introduce yourself, everyone gets really confused. Like, oh, I didn't know that X person was even gone at this point. Oh, we just kind of assumed and whatever. So
I have a question mostly for Brian and Casey. And that is that both of your schools, correct me if I'm wrong, I know for a fact for Casey, but I think also for Brian, people will go to your school just for the marching band. Do you use marching band as a recruiting tool at all?
Not on my watch, they don't.
I mean,
yeah.
You go first, Casey.
It does so much. Like, yeah, it seems to be there is a like there's always seems to be a healthy pile of auditionees here, and yeah, you definitely talk to plenty of them that are, the marching band gets JMU on their radar. So that's great because I don't have to do anything. I just let that happen and listen to them audition and go accordingly. And it's really great. Yeah, some of my strongest students now in their sophomore year were really drawn here because of the marching band. But then you show them other things, and they I think a wonderful thing about that, there's often this little, I think, false worry tied to, well, if they're really into marching band, then there's no way they're going to tolerate a session on tambourine. And that's been the opposite has been true every time in my case. They have always been open to all these different things, or you think, oh, if they're really into marching band, well, there's no way they'll tolerate contemporary music. No, they sure have. It's been really cool. Brian, I think.
Sorry to jump in. What I'll also say about students of mine that are really into marching band is they develop this really strong work ethic, and they're willing to practice and rehearse long hours and just get it done. And in the end, the world of percussion is wide, but everything is related. And I think students see that there's a relation between what they're playing in marching band and tambourine, like you said, or anything in the concert.
And they drink better too, like, so they're fun to hang out with.
Oh, jeez.
Right?
I wouldn't know about that.
Casey's absolutely right. And one of the things I tell my students is that my job is to prepare you for the real world. And so you're absolutely right, Ben. Like, there are a lot of students that I get that are showing up because they saw the McNeese State Marching Band play at an exhibition or whatever. And so they're there because they want to be in that drum line. And I'm like, cool, that's great, no problem. And then from there, I just let them know, like, okay, well, if you're going to be a music major, you'll also be learning mallets and the accessories and timpani and drum set and like all of these things. And I just frame it simply as, I think Scott Johnson from the Blue Devils, he said this once years ago in a clinic. He was like, those of you out there that want to have my job, you have better odds of being a Major League Baseball pitcher than of having my job. Was the way he framed it. And so I just kind of put it like that. I was like, listen, marching percussion's great. I did a lot of it. I've taught it. Like, I understand that, and that's great. But at the end of the day, you want to be employed. And so while that will help you absolutely gain employment, if that's the only thing that you do, it's going to be a really tough time. And so that's usually the way I frame it.
This isn't related to marching band. This is actually going back to a little bit to what Carly was saying about hosting events and things like that. Sometimes you might live and teach in an area that's rural enough that might not be possible. Some of the students can't get into campus to take part in your event. If your state has an all district or an all town, whatever, all city sort of thing, you might consider making videos. So if there's if they do an all district, for instance, that has a keyboard component, a timpani component, and a snare drum component, and they're all prescribed things. I think an easy thing to do is to make videos of those and put them on YouTube, put them on Facebook, put them on Instagram, and then you get you out there, and the kids. You're really helping the kids as well, since they have a professional model. And I found when I've done that, it's a very easy in then to go talk to the area band directors and say, hey, I made these videos, and if you want me to come out and clinic, your students are getting ready for these contests, happy to come out and give a clinic on them as well.
I think I should just add with every question we've covered so far, a lot of stuff has been framed in, well, here's what I will do, or here's what I would do if given the chance to. If you have the opportunity and are lucky enough to have already done some of these things, and you can say, they say, for instance, well, how will you recruit? And you can say, well, what worked for me before was to do this, 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 and this. So not only like, well, hypothetically, here's what I would do, but like, nope, this is what I did. This is what works. And I was also going to say, speaking of alumni, it's not a terrible idea to answer this question, the recruitment question, with what might be another question. Another common question is, what do you know about our institution? Why do you want a job at this institution? And that's when you are, quote, supposed to sit there and say, oh, look, I studied who the president's name is, and I studied the mission statement, and I did all this stuff that anyone can do, and I read up on it. Like, yeah, okay, fine, you should probably do that, but you can bring it up in recruiting. You can say, well, I know in this area the following alumni exist, and I actually have contacts with these people. I mean, if it's true, certainly you don't want to just, say, oh, look, I researched a couple names.
So that was kind of Ben Fraley's question that you sort of just answered. But I wanted to ask a question that I don't think any of our Facebook questions covered, that I've heard a couple of times. And I think it's a even more difficult question than the strengths and weakness question. And that is something along the lines of, tell us about a time that you've had a conflict with a student and how you've resolved it. Because I think it's difficult because none of us want to say, like, well, I was fighting with this student of mine and he was being a real jerk. And I I guess to this day, I still am not. I kind of have an idea of how you're supposed to answer that question, and I would probably think of like a student that was struggling with something and basically how you helped them through it. But has anyone else encountered that question, or does anyone else have thoughts on that question?
I had a similar version of that question here, which was what would you do with a difficult student or a student that's maybe not keeping up with everyone else? And I think it's important, you said, I don't know how to answer that question. It's like, yeah, what are they looking for in that? They're looking for what personality traits does this person have that's going to that's going to allow them to deal with students, and like how do they deal with problems, and like I think you kind of have to think to yourself like, well, yeah, what are the good attributes that are involved when dealing with difficult people? Like, you're in a position of power over these people who are supposed to be doing this and that for you for a grade, and like how do you approach them when they're being difficult, so it's like, okay, yeah, if you have ways where you're empathetic and you show extra effort to care for the students, you give the student a reasonable amount of, say, second chances, or you dedicate extra time to a makeup exam or an extra lesson, or that sort of thing. And again, I don't think you should just say these things, but like, if you've done them before, great. Like, yeah, tell them the whole story. Anyone else?
This one's a funny question because I can't think of any conflict I've had with students other than you're not doing your job and we need to figure out how to make sure you're doing your job. So for me, it's you have to figure out why, and every student is different, and sometimes they're having problems at home, or family problems, or money problems, or partying problems. There's just so many different things, and also what we have to do as teachers is guess, and try to guess correctly. Do they need tough love, or do they need just like encouragement, or what combination of things can we say will have the best impact? But I guess that's a more common version of this question probably, is how do you help a student that's struggling? And for me, the first thing is figure out why, and then target that in the best way you know how.
Well, and you just had a great answer because you were honest. You said, well, I haven't encountered that yet. But then you like displayed all this knowledge, so
Right.
like you didn't really answer it, but you told us something really valuable about yourself. And you also said like, oh, maybe like, wow, you've been teaching as much and as long as you have, and you haven't had a conflict yet. Well, that speaks pretty well for you too, So yeah, that's a really good answer, what you just described, I think.
If you're talking about a conflict that goes beyond just the normal I'm not practicing sort of conflict and how to get better, you may want to just talk about, well, I'm sure the university or the Department of Music has a policy in place if I'm dealing with that, and I'm going to follow that to the letter. So, if there's a legal side of things, whether it's a Title VII or a Title IX violation, something like that, just say, hey, the university has a code in place. I'm going to do the appropriate steps to make sure that it's resolved that way.
Mm-hmm. Hey, so Scott Farkas on Facebook had a good comment, and also inside of it a little question that I think is common. And he says, as someone who conducts a lot of interviews, I find that candidates are often really prepared to answer all kinds of questions about their content, but swing and miss on things like this question: why do you want this job? So what do you guys think about that? How do you like to answer that question?
I'll go. I think that I don't think that there's an issue with being pretty honest about things. I think the one cardinal rule with answering that question is you don't speak ill of your current employer.
Yeah.
So if I say, oh, well, my current job is awful and the people are the worst and the students are bad and I just really want to get out of there, like that would be just probably the worst possible way you can answer that. But to say things like, I know of the department, and I know, having looked at the department, I see all of this success. I had an interview at one point with a place where I knew a lot of alumni that had done really great things. And so I said, listen, this place has a proven track record for decades, because I knew them over a long period of time, that have done really, really great things. And I think that it would be really exciting to be a part of that. And I honestly, the last thing is, I don't think that it's necessarily a problem bringing up not necessarily personal, but things that don't have anything to do with the actual job. Like, well, I currently live in a more rural area, and given the fact that this job is in a larger city is really exciting for me. That's something that excites me. But I'll be honest, when we left North Dakota, one of the reasons was we knew no one, like we didn't have, like, family was far, 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 far away. So leaving North Dakota, the job at Troy I was blatant about, this is closer to my wife's family in Atlanta, and that's a really exciting thing for us personally. So I don't think that those things are bad things to really bring up. I think it humanizes you to a point. The one cardinal rule is just don't talk ill of your current employer.
So one thing I'll add to that is that I think it's good you can talk about what's attractive to you about the position, whether it's musical or related to the school or totally personal. But I think you want to make sure that the reason you want that job is not just what the job offers to you, but if you can turn it into what you can offer to that position in that department and that community, then that can round out the answer in a nice way.
Okay, and then also to piggyback onto what Brian was saying about don't talk bad about your current job, it's easy to get into the mode of sort of whining about your current job and, well, God, like and I'm not speaking about my current job when I say this, just to be clear, but oh God, like the trumpet professor is just a jerk all the time, and the department chair is taking away all funding for everything, and we can't even repair our drum heads that are broken. You can, instead of like complaining, just turn them into positives and say, well, I noticed online that it seems like you have a really good percussion inventory, and it excites me that I could work at a school that can provide students with many professional grade instruments. It's saying the exact same thing, but in a completely different context that they would probably much rather hear.
I have to say, just related to this, just a personal note and something that I've seen true watching other people go through this process. I don't think I interviewed well until I was happy at my current job. So starting off in my first adjunct teaching job, it was like really difficult, and a lot of the things they describe, like, oh man, the gear is like this, and there's no funding, and da 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 da, and oh man, how am I going to stay here? Like, it took a year or two of that, for me to learn really how a university works, so that when you do sit down with the dean, you know what is an appropriate dean question, because you truly know what a dean does. You didn't read it in a book. You like actually have gone back and forth with them and worked with them. And likewise, the department chair, you know what the department chair does versus the dean. So it did take a few years to like actually learn that. But I think more importantly, and just so I could be able to sit down and be myself and be like comfortable and answer these questions and not be like so afraid to, if I say the wrong thing or whatever, like it did take me being happy at that first job. And I remember thinking, like, here at JMU, thinking like, oh man, this place is awesome. And like, look at this place. I would love to work here. But I also remember thinking like, yeah, if I don't get this, it's like, okay, I really like where I am, and I could totally do this for, you know, if I had to, I could retire at this other place. That wouldn't be the end of the world.
Casey, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I remember you talking to me about your first few interviews, and you said they asked you, do you have any questions? And you're like, yeah, like, so like, if a drum head broke, like, what would be the process for like getting the funding to fix that or repair that?
Right.
Yeah, like, so certainly knowing who you're talking to and what kinds of things you should be speaking about.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't that I asked specifically, but I do remember thinking like, okay, I'm going in to talk to the dean, and like thinking to myself like, wait, what the heck does a dean do? Like I didn't really know, like truly, you know, I didn't truly know what types of stuff I'd be working with when you talk to the dean. Like, well, when you would talk to the dean, it would be about the following, and when you would talk to a department chair, it would be about the following. So yeah, exactly.
But you bring up a valid, like, that question is it's maybe not that specific question, but it is a valid point of knowing those things and asking those things. Where does your budget, you know, is there a certain budget? Does it come from the department, or does it come from, like, say, the marching band or athletic band's budget? Like, how does, like, those are all valid questions. And if you don't have questions, I mean, that we've probably done this all when we've had like students that have auditioned for us. I'm like, do you have any questions about our program? And they're like, no. It looks a little bit sometimes like, well, has this person done any sort of research or whatever? So if you don't have any questions, that's that's a red flag to me. If I were on a search committee for a job and a candidate did not have any questions for the search committee about things, that would be a little bit of a red flag for me. I'm just like, do they even care about this?
Yeah. Well, and I'm also speaking to asking the right questions to the right person, because I think like what Ben's point is, if you're going to the dean and saying, oh yeah, so like, if they break a drum head, like who pays for that?
Right.
Like the dean is probably going to be like, dude, what? I don't know. Talk to your area head or talk to the chair. Like what I don't know. So yeah, but yeah, of course, like you do want to have questions. And I think actually someone on Facebook asked that same thing. Do you have that handy, Carly?
Yeah. So I have. I was just saying, yeah. So we're kind of in Brady Spitz land here. Brady said, "What are good questions for the candidate to ask the committee? This may be specific to each committee or school, but a direction to go in or stay away from would be helpful." And in my experience, one of the most impressive things is when you ask them a question that they should be asking you. So, for example,
like what's your greatest strength and greatest weakness?
Well, no. For example, like if you do your research and you realize that 70% of the students in such and such area are living under the poverty line, and you say, I noticed that 70% of the students in the such and such metropolitan area are living under the poverty line. What do you do to serve that population? All of a sudden, it's like, whoa, this guy. It's almost just you showing off your knowledge about the area rather than generically, what's your recruiting strategy, something like that.
Yeah, that's cool. That shows a care and an interest and a knowledge.
Yeah, something like along those lines. Like if we go to the recruiting thing that we talked about before, I've asked, and I'll ask something like, okay, I see that I've seen that you host a marching band competition, and I see that the major ensembles tend to go out and do a tour in the spring. Are there other major recruiting initiatives from the department or from the School of Music beyond those that I just don't know about? Maybe summer camps or so on and so forth.
Yeah, for sure. I like asking about scholarship money and availability, and just because I actually wanted to know. I really, really wanted to know. Bill, I think.
Some of the questions you should maybe avoid. Sorry if I was talking too loud. Some of the questions you may want to avoid would be something like, what's the salary of this position? Is this position benefits eligible? Some of that information should be available online anyway, and you don't want to ask and say, hey, I'm just coming here for the money. So I would avoid asking any sorts of things like that, especially if you're just in the phone interview phase. The face-to-face, you might consider it. I'm sure the music director will tell you about that, but I wouldn't ask that. Some of the questions I made a quick list of things back when I did interview for Memphis, and some of the things that I asked. Let's see here. What are the current strengths of the program, and what would you like to see added to the program? What are some departmental requirements beyond what you've listed on the job description? What are the current priorities of this position and those areas of percussion that you consider essential for your students to master? So those are just a few of the thoughts out there.
This is more of it's not related to the job per se, but related to the interview. But I've never had a problem asking this, and I've never had a committee that I've never heard that this was a problem. But usually after the if it's not addressed in the interview, be it the phone, Skype interview, or the on-campus interview, by the end, like kind of the last moment where they're like, do you have any questions? I'll usually just ask, I'm just kind of curious as to what the timeline is now, because we sit around for so long and play the waiting game again of wondering like, oh, what? So I don't think it's out of bounds to ask just, could you give me a general timeline of where this process is going from here? And they might be very specific about like, well, we have one more candidate coming in on Tuesday, and then when the committee meets on Wednesday, and we hope to offer, have an offer out by Friday. Or it might be, well, we have a few other candidates to meet, and so we're hoping to wrap this up and make an offer in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Like, so they could be very specific or very general, but I don't think that some people get really worried about that. To me, that's not an out of bounds question, just because you need to know it's part of it's your life as well.
I think it's okay to treat it as a genuine question, especially since you said at the end of it all, if they say, do you have any questions? Because you know what you've covered, you know how much discussion there's already been about X, Y, and Z. And rather than say like, oh, okay, they're asking me if I have any questions, I really don't, but it's a game and I need to play this game of like, let me show you what I care about by asking you a question. It's like, no, you know what? Sometimes it's just like literally like, if you have any questions, you know, like that can totally be okay, especially if you've covered the important stuff that you know you have. And I think rather than cranking your brain out to try to come up with some, oh, if I can just shine one more time, here we go. Like, no, just be genuine. Ask them something you're actually curious about. That's okay.
If I may add real quick, I think if there's any way you can steer the interview and make it more conversational rather than you go, now
Yep.
you go, now you go, now you go. I think
Yeah.
that's always to your benefit if you can just make it as natural conversationally as possible.
I agree with that so much, and I've said it many times to people doing about to do an interview or as do mock interview or something. Try to say like they're already impressed with you. If you're sitting there in an interview and they're asking you these questions, like they're already impressed with your talents and your abilities and your knowledge. You don't necessarily have to retell any of those things, and in fact they really want to know your personality. And I know that that's what I would be interested with. I feel like I could find out so much from someone's CV and their website and all those things, but when I'm finally face to face with them, I want to learn face to face stuff. Like I want to learn, what are you going to be like as a colleague, and even if you're not the best X player in the world, well, like I have to like live with you for like 30 years maybe.
And sometimes that might not be possible because you might be dealing with a committee that's talking to like 10 or 15 candidates in a very small amount of time, and the chair of the committee might just kind of steamroll that idea, and you just, it is 15 minutes and in and out. So you just kind of have
Sure.
to feel that one out.
I guess so, yeah. Who has me? Did I steamroll? What do you mean? I didn't steamroll.
No, I was making a joke.
Damn it. Well, hey, let's grab another one from Facebook so we can try to get through these. Chris White, our buddy Chris White says, how are you innovative in your teaching? That's a question. Anybody want to bite on that?
I know for me, one of the things that helped out was just saying, hey, I love to use technology in these different ways, whether it's like, creating videos, making sure the students know how to create videos and audio content, have website, things like that. I think technology, at least for University of Memphis, was a big draw.
Yeah, this is like one of the few areas I feel like I can speak to because it's the one question I've gotten so far. But it was actually for a theory gig, but to tag on to Bill, it was the same thing. Like I looked up that they used Canvas, so I made sure I knew how to do all the ins and out of like, I was talking about doing timestamp recordings with MP3s when like chords come up, like a secondary dominant, stuff like that. And yeah, I feel like if I felt that they felt it was impressive that I knew their system and I could, like, it wasn't just BS. Like I had a plan of action on how to implement it successfully.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I've answered this question successfully with a weird answer, which is I don't know that I am all that innovative. Like the field itself is innovative enough, and with how new pieces all the time, like now you have to have a sound interface and you have to have Max MSP and you have to have this plugin and you have to use digital delay and you got to keep up with everyone's expectations of all your students have websites and all your students have recording and all these things. I mean, is that innovative or is that just kind of keeping step with everything else? So again, like I don't know, it's more just like, hey, look at my realistic outlook on the current state of the field and just how in touch with how it is supposed to be. Like that for me is innovative enough. And I think the way this has been taught for all the decades before us has worked really well, but now we just have to keep pace with what else is out there. Bill?
If you're talking about innovation in teaching as well, one thing you may want to consider is that a lot of universities are going towards a more project and goal-oriented model. So some way that you can say, hey, my traditional model for lessons may not be just teaching the one-on-one lesson, but it's going to get a group of these people together to do a project either out in the community where there's a tangible piece of evidence, a tangible outcome. That's something that's really, really hot now. I know right now at the University of Memphis, I was sitting on a committee that was looking at several other universities that were doing some of those things, Miami being one of them, and seeing what they're doing and leading the innovation charge that way. And so I think anything you might bring up, if you feel comfortable, that could be something to take a look at, is like, how do you break out of the traditional one-on-one lesson model and make it into more of a goal or a project-oriented outcome?
That's great. You heard innovative as meaning that, because I immediately, my mind went to technology right away too. But yeah, you're totally right. Like, that's not necessarily that's probably not what that question means. Like, no, like, how do you teach differently, whether it's technology or not?
I think one of the other things you can think about is the fact of using your students as a resource. I mean, the reality is all of us are just getting older, but our demographic of students is always going to be 18 to 23, 24, maybe for undergrad to master's, maybe to doctorate, right? They're always going to be that age. And so looking at them as saying like, hey, I saw you were using this app the other day. What was that? Or if they mention a new social media platform, it's being like, hey, what is that thing? I mean, they're going to be the ones that are going to have their fingers on the pulse of that much, much more readily than we possibly will, especially as we get older. And so using them as a resource to help you move forward in that way might be a good thing as well.
I have a question. If any of y'all have done interviews recently, and I think I know how I would answer it, but I'm sure there's more out there that I don't. And that's this. I know the idea of diversity and inclusion is coming up more and more and more. Has anyone had to answer any questions about how would you be more diverse or more inclusive in your teaching outside of maybe, I mean, I know the safe answer is always, oh, well, I can program more people of color or women composers, but so it seems like a very stock, too bland of an answer.
I will say, so I've been asked this question, and the job that I was interviewing for, I looked up their statistics for demographics ahead of time, and I noticed that, I won't say which job it was, but 85% of this area was white. And I think it was the third question they asked was, how will you recruit a diverse percussion studio? And I mean, immediately I panicked because I was like, I'm white. The area is 85% white. All 5 committee members are white. Like, how on earth can I talk about diversity in this situation? And I think that maybe you can broaden your outlook on diversity. First of all, I think it's important to speak to why you think diversity is important. And there are a lot of companies that have some sort of company creed about, like Apple comes to mind, about how different experiences or backgrounds help us create better products, something like that. But then also in the field of percussion, I think that the easiest diversity statistic to go to, and everyone should have a 50-50 balance of this, really, is male and female. How many percussion studios do we see that are 15 guys and 2 girls or something like that? It's just, how are you going to recruit diversity in that? And then you can use that as an avenue to talk about representation. And Caleb already mentioned like the whole like stock answer of like in your programming, having a diversity of male and female, and mostly female, because we already have plenty of male composers and non-white composers. But yeah, I think that's like a very safe venue to talk about it. And you can talk about guest artists that you bring in, and you'd like to bring in Evelyn Glennie to your school or something like that. You don't have to tell them how much that'll cost, but yeah. So I think that representation is the easiest way, because it in a lot of situations your demographics are going to be reflective of what's there. I mean, if you are teaching in South Texas, you are far more likely to have many Hispanic students than if you're teaching in, rural Illinois or something like that.
Yeah, sure. I like speaking more about percussion just in general and just how diverse it inherently is. So even when you're playing Prokofiev, but hey, there's castanets in the concerto, and you're playing, I mean, every percussion music is in fact world music, even the most like the most generic stuff we are used to. There's so much you can say to like, well, luckily for us, it is so inherently diverse, and then go ahead and pick your favorite examples of instruments or repertoire or whatever.
I was just going to say, honestly, I was going to say the same thing. The reality is you can say that, well, percussion in and of itself is diverse when you consider the fact that we could have guest artists that are coming and representing and talking about the steel drum from Trinidad and Tobago, or Afro-Cuban percussion from Cuba, or West African percussion, or Brazilian percussion, or we're bringing in a frame drummer who is from Egypt or whatever, or at least representing those things. That will kind of helps to broach that subject as well, I'd say.
Well, I have one thing to add. I haven't had to address this in an interview, but one thing that I try to do to promote diversity and inclusion in our program is just making sure that there's an inclusive environment, that everybody is included in discussions and everybody feels like a valued member of the studio, and fostering that I've found makes a big difference. And it's one of the things I love the most about my students here is the way they treat each other, male and female, and different ethnicities and backgrounds. Just fostering that kind of inclusivity is valuable.
Cool. Well, we didn't just have Facebook questions. We also had some comments, and our buddy Adam Silverman wrote, "At my university, and I think this is probably common, we are required to prepare a set of questions that is asked of all candidates in order to provide consistency in phone interviews. I think this is extremely unfortunate. The only way one can hope to get great answers is by asking questions that allow the candidate to express their individuality and speak to their strengths. If one is asked a question that is difficult to answer, I'm imagining that the problem may be in the question." I think that's a really cool observation, and it is unfortunate. I know I've only been on one hiring committee ever, but I can understand that. It's like, well, these two candidates are very different, and yet we have to come up with the same set of questions for the same people, and to do so, it might kind of dilute your questions, so you aren't really asking anyone the optimal question for them, but you're finding this kind of homogenized general question that's, I don't know, like a second-rate question for everyone, rather than any first-rate questions for anyone, if that makes sense.
I think that there's a couple of things. One, I think that those questions, especially when you get to the interviews, ideally, especially if you get to the on-campus interview, are ideally acting as springboards. Hopefully, they're going to put you in a certain direction by which then other follow-up questions can be asked that maybe aren't quite related, that maybe aren't going to be asked of others because they didn't really answer the question the same way you did. But there are situations. My best friend is also an academic in the field of speech therapy, and he had an interview for a university, I want to say in Minnesota, and I think all the teachers, including higher ed, are unionized there. And he said it was the strangest interview he ever went on, because he walked into one room and they sat there and they just read down this list of questions. And, okay, great, thanks for me. And then he walks into another room, sits down, and another person asks him the exact same questions from the list. And there was no diverging of anything, because union rules, I guess, specifically stated that everyone had to be asked the exact same thing in the exact same way, and so on. So it can be a very strange experience, depending on where you're depending on what state you're interviewing in and what the system is.
I would just say, keep in mind, like, these frustrations. Sorry, Ben, classic steamroll, Casey, but it's real quick. Keep in mind all these, restraints and restrictions, like, they all come up for good reasons, like, it is from a good place that they come from. And just, like, remind yourself, if you're ever in that situation where you're like, wait a minute, I'm asking the same question that I just answered in another question, but they have these procedures they have to follow, and that is so that they can make the search really fair and try to give equal opportunity to anyone who might be applying.
Ben, my turn to steamroll you, Ben. I'm sorry, dude. I stepped in it during an interview where I was on the search committee, so that's why I'm saying this now, Ben. Sorry. I just making small talk with a candidate. To be clear, I was on the search committee. We were interviewing someone for a director of bands position, and I just was making small talk with them and said, he had mentioned his family, and I said, "Oh, like what does your wife do?" or something like that. And he was very nice. He's like, "Oh," and he said whatever. And I was very young, and I just didn't know any better. And he was fine. There was no animosity or whatever. And then my chair pulled me aside very quickly and was like, "You cannot ask that. You cannot ask anything personal." And I was like, "Oh," I thought I'd screwed everything up, and everything was fine. It was no big deal. But there's part of that too. Is there's a lot of questions that are not allowed to be asked because they can take you on a path that could be looked at as impartial or so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had two things. Now, one, I was that not literally that candidate when Brian was interviewing someone, but I was that candidate when someone asked me, "So are you married?" And it wasn't an interview question; it was just offhand. But then I was going to say also on the other side of the coin to what we were talking about with the prepared list of questions. Don't try and read the committee. I think like, why did they ask that question, or what was the right answer, or did they like my answer, or am I going to get their goal is to have a poker face. Like their goal is to not show any emotion. And so even if it's weird the way they're asking a question or something, like just do your best. You cannot like I had no idea of how my interview went here till I got the job and they said, "Oh, your interview was awesome." So yeah. Mm-hmm. Ksenia.
I have another Facebook question. Sarek Gutierrez said, "I got asked the dreaded question of why should we pick you over the other finalists? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on a good response." Has anyone ever gotten that before? Because I haven't. And I never thought that could be asked.
I don't know if I have.
I feel like it'd be this would be illegal, but you can't really answer that question if you don't know who the other finalists are. I mean, unless you're like the whole interview has been, "Why should you pick me?" So if it's like, "Why should you pick me or Carly?" I can't. I can't.
You should say something. You should say something that speaks to your general knowledge of the field. You should say like, "Well, of course, I don't know who else you're interviewing, but my guess is, in my experience, the academy really prepares people very well in the following things, and I would assume that the other candidates are great at this, and this, and I would say I'm probably not so far different from that, but one thing I do different is I do this ridiculous podcast I've been doing for 5 years, and we talk about these things, and as far as I know, I'm the only person out there doing that, so that might be one way that stands out, but I'm guessing we're, the 4 or 5 of us that you're interviewing. Yeah, we probably have much more common strengths than divergent strengths. I mean, I don't know, use that language. That sounded really lame, but something like that. Like I think you can like complement the field at large and then make a point of how you stand out in the couple of ways you might, and that shows some humility and also shows some knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. Amen. Good job.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's the same question of why should we pick you for this job? Yeah. Like, so what are your strengths? And that's where you just kind of paint, well, here's how I feel that I'm maybe different from, here's what I bring to the table that maybe not everyone else would.
Yeah. Well, and you could say like, a thing our field does really well and something I could trust, any DMA graduate will be able to do this, and this. And that's funny for me to say because I don't have a DMA, but what I can do is this other thing or something,
I've been told time and time again, a committee wants to hire somebody that they can go out and have a beer with.
Yeah.
So I think that's super duper important, and like that you just click and that you're a good person and it's somebody that they want to go have a beer with.
Well, and that's why I like my comments. Like I'm showing this humility of like, well, yeah, maybe I might not be that much different than the other people you're looking at. I may not be that much better, and I don't know who those people are, and I bet they're great. But here's a few other things I know how to do. Yeah, I think being able to admit some weakness somewhere in there is a good collegial trait.
Jim, this wasn't a job interview per se, but when I was interviewing for my doctorate at Kentucky, Jim Campbell specifically said, if I can't see myself having lunch with you once a week, this just isn't going to work out.
Yeah.
So, cool. And yeah, the reality is people want to work with their friends. And even if they're not necessarily your friend during the interview, the fact is they want to see someone that they could ideally resonate with personally. And yeah, that if they can't just see that sort of collegiality, then this is just not going to work.
Yeah, yeah. Our buddy Tom Hansenflug says, as a guy who does a lot of the interviewing, a couple of points for applicants. One, be prepared to explain concisely what you bring to the position and quote why they should hire you. So many applicants can't seem to answer the why should I hire you question effectively. Two, the manner in which you answer the question is important as the answer itself. Your personality matters. They want colleagues, not robots. Great. Yeah, we've covered that several times. Three, if the committee sticks tightly to a script of questions, as they often are required to, and they ask a question that you literally just answered in detail as part of a previous answer, then do not fumble around trying to restate the answer. Simply reference them to what you said a minute ago. I made this mistake many years ago as an applicant and tanked a phone interview because of it. I think that relates to what I was saying. Like whenever there's something odd or frustrating in the process or the procedures of it, just remember like those procedures come for good reasons and they come from a meaningful place. They just might not be coming off.
I was going to say that's actually a very likely scenario because, like, for example, they could ask, tell us about your recruiting strategy, and you go on and on. And then the next question could be, tell us how you plan to recruit a diverse percussion studio. Well, if you've probably just covered that if you really, really, really did a good job in the previous question. And yeah, that's like a perfect example of how that could, come up. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, and I think it speaks to what Bill said about try to make it as conversational as possible. It's very easy to do that if the vibe's conversational because you just say like, sure, going back to what I was saying a minute ago, blah, 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 and then tag on whatever you need to. Or if they're feeling conversational, I've had them say before, hey, yeah, we kind of just asked you this, but we got to go through the questions, so here it is, and just lay it out. But anyway, one more from our buddy Tom. He says, your answer should reference and be in tune with the position description, and you should know a few things about the department you interview. Simple courtesy knowledge goes a long way with the committee. Means you are interested in them enough to care. So yeah, really good tips from Tom Hansenflug. Thanks for writing in. Anything else you all want to say or ask or make sure we get out there?
I'll say real quick, I think just like you would for an orchestra audition, make sure you practice interviewing all the time, especially as you're leading up to the interview. I know for me, one of the things that was incredibly helpful was actually Casey interviewing me and going back and forth. So I would just say, like, just like you would do mock auditions for your orchestra auditions, do mock interviews leading up to it.
Yeah. Yep. I totally agree.
I second that, and actually, it's a I think benefit that a lot of schools have in their alumni association or for current students is like there's a career center where you can go and do a mock interview, not with a friend and with an administrator or somebody I've done this and they did their research and pulled up all the questions that are common related to music teaching jobs. It was super helpful.
Yeah, I know we've talked about the book On Staff before. It is this book by a Mr. Donald Hammond, and there's a huge list of potential interview questions in there. Man, just drop your finger on one, read it out loud, and then practice saying your answer out loud, and then do it again and again and again and again. Record yourself answering those, listen to it on the car ride over just to get yourself comfortable with what you're saying and what you said before. And anyway, well, okay. Hey, well, thank you all. This was a interesting episode and really different. And hopefully those of you young folks who are maybe applying for jobs soon, this is, a little bit of insight from the early to mid professor perspective. So cool. All right, guys. Thank you. Catch you later.
Bye.
See ya.
That's a sad bye.
Like we're making ASMR videos.
Yeah, everyone whisper bye. That's good. I'm still recording. Let's keep it.
Wait. So I have to tell you guys this story. So my